The Banda Islands, a small cluster of volcanic islands in what is now eastern Indonesia. They may seem insignificant on a map of the world, but in the 16th and 17th centuries, these islands held something of such value that European powers would literally go to war over it. Nutmeg. Not just any spice, but the spice. The one commodity that could make a merchant wealthy beyond imagination. A spice so precious that in medieval Europe, a single pound of nutmeg could cost as much as a cow. The question is, how did a corporation transform these islands of thriving traders into a hollow graveyard? And how did they use those islands to claim dominance over the world's spice trade? To understand this, we must travel back in time to when the Banda Islands were home to thriving communities that had controlled their own destiny for centuries. Before anything went wrong, the Bandanese people were the kings of their own islands. For thousands of years, they controlled the spice trade across the archipelago and beyond. The Banda Islands were unlike any other place on Earth. Hidden in the warm waters of the eastern seas, these volcanic islands grew something that grew nowhere else: nutmeg trees. Not just a few of them, but enough to supply the entire world. And they weren't alone in this trade. The Bandanese were sophisticated merchants who had established trade relationships with Indian traders, Arab merchants, Chinese businessmen, and anyone else who wanted their precious spices. They had a unique form of government too. Rather than a single ruler, the islands were led by a council of elders called the Orang Kaya, which literally meant rich men. These men were not just political leaders, they were traders themselves, powerful merchants who had built their wealth through centuries of commerce. By the early 1600s, the population of the Banda Islands stood at somewhere around 13,000 to 15,000 people. These were free people living in a free society, running their own affairs, and profiting handsomely from the treasure that grew on their land. But everything changed when Europeans discovered that they could sail directly to Asia by going around Africa. In 1512, the Portuguese became the first Europeans to reach the Banda Islands. However, when Captain Garcia tried to build a fort there in 1529, the Bandanese resisted fiercely and forced him to leave. The Portuguese got the message. This wasn't going to be an easy place to conquer, so instead of fighting, they simply bought nutmeg from traders in Malacca and sailed back to Europe. For the Portuguese, the Banda Islands were just too remote and too difficult to control. They decided their effort was better spent elsewhere. And so the Bandanese continued their lives trading with whoever came to their shores. In 1595, Dutch merchants organized their first voyage to Indonesia, attempting to break Portugal's dominance of the spice trade. By 1599, a Dutch fleet commanded by Jacob van Heemskerk arrived in the Banda Islands. At first, things seemed peaceful. Van Heemskerk signed several contracts with the local Orang Kaya and even established a small trading post. Unlike the Portuguese before them, the Dutch seemed willing to trade. They bought spices, paid fair prices, and the Bandanese welcomed another buyer. Competition, after all, was good for business. The Bandanese could play traders off against each other and get better prices. But as more Dutch merchants arrived, competition grew so fierce that it threatened to eat away at everyone's profits. So in 1602, the Dutch government did something revolutionary. It consolidated all these competing Dutch merchant companies into a single massive corporation, the Dutch East India Company, or as they called it in Dutch, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the VOC. The Dutch government gave this company something extraordinary. A government-granted monopoly on all Dutch trade between the Cape of Good Hope and the Straits of Magellan. More than that, the VOC was given the right to declare war, sign treaties with rulers, and establish its own forts and armies. In other words, it was a corporation that had the power of a nation-state. The VOC had just been handed a blank check to do whatever it wanted in the East Indies. Initially, the Dutch tried the merchant approach. They bought spices at negotiated prices. But here's where things got complicated. In 1605, The VOC convinced some of the Orang Kaya to sign a treaty granting the Dutch an exclusive monopoly on nutmeg and mace purchases. Sounds good for the VOC, right? The problem was that the Bandanese didn't see why they should obey this. The treaty had been signed by some leaders, but Banda's decentralized government meant there was no central authority to enforce it. So when English traders arrived offering better prices, the Bandanese traders simply did what made economic sense. They sold to the English. They also continued selling to Portuguese merchants, Malay traders, massacres merchants, and anyone else who showed up with money. The VOC viewed this as betrayal. In 1608, when an English ship arrived at Bandanese, a Dutch admiral named Peter Willems Verhoef decided to use force. He landed with fully armed troops and demanded to meet with the Orang Kaya. The Bandanese leaders, frightened by the show of military force, asked Verhoef to come with only a handful of people for peaceful negotiations. Verhoef, however, had other ideas. When he arrived at the meeting spot, the Bandanese leaders sprang a trap. In the ensuing violence, Verhoef and more than 30 of his men were killed. The Bandanese had made a critical mistake. They had killed a representative of the VOC, and the corporation would not forgive this. The Dutch retaliated with fury. VOC ships attacked settlements along the coasts of both Bandanese and Lontor, reducing them to rubble and burning ships. The violence was shocking. The Bandanese had never experienced warfare like this. Their society had been built on trade and negotiation, not military conquest. But the Orang Kaya had no choice. By August 1608, they agreed to a new, even harsher treaty. This time, the treaty was effectively impossible to keep. The VOC demanded that the Bandanese sell them all their spices at a price far below market value, and they demanded exclusivity. They also stationed Dutch soldiers on the islands to enforce these terms. But here's the thing, the Bandanese had no intention of following this agreement. The moment the Dutch were distracted elsewhere, the Bandanese went back to trading with their traditional partners. They smuggled nutmeg to English traders, sold it to Portuguese merchants, and continued their centuries-old trading network. The VOC's leadership in Amsterdam was furious. They viewed every nutmeg sold to a non-Dutch buyer as a loss of money that rightfully belonged to them. By 1614, the VOC's board of directors, called the Heron 17, made a fateful decision. They concluded that it was necessary to conquer the entire Bandanese archipelago, even if it meant destroying the native population. They were willing to accept that the islands might be left empty, because in their calculation, a monopoly with no people was better than a free trade with living competitors. In 1615, Gerard Reinst, the Governor-General of the VOC, landed on Bandanese with a military force. They attacked the island of Ai, a smaller island in the archipelago. The Bandanese put up resistance, but they were no match for the Dutch, with their superior weapons and military training. As the Dutch soldiers overwhelmed the defenses, something terrible happened. During the fighting, approximately 400 Bandanese, many of them women and children, tried to flee by sea to reach the nearby English-controlled island of Run. They drowned trying to escape. The Dutch killed any Bandanese who resisted, and then they built Fort der Rake, Fort Revenge, on the island of Ai. It was a message. This is what happens when you don't obey the Dutch East India Company. For a brief moment, it seemed the show of force might work. The Orang Kaya on the other Banda Islands signed new contracts promising to trade exclusively with the Dutch. But once again, the Bandanese didn't hold to their agreement. Desperate to maintain their independence and their livelihoods, they continued trading with English merchants and others. The VOC leadership saw this as the final straw. In 1617, the Dutch government appointed a new governor-general named Jan Pieter Zoon Cohen. Cohen had one goal, to get the monopoly on nutmeg, and he was willing to go to any length to achieve it. When asked how to accomplish this, Cohen wrote back to his superiors with brutal clarity. He said that to adequately deal with this matter, it was necessary to subjugate Banda and populate it with other people. In other words, remove the Bandanese entirely and replace them with people who would obey. In March 1621, Cohen departed Batavia with an enormous fleet. He brought 13 large warships, reconnaissance boats, 40 sailboats and sloops, 1,600 Dutch soldiers, 300 Javanese convicts, 100 Japanese samurai hired as mercenaries, and freed slaves. This wasn't a trading expedition, it was an invasion. On March 4th and 5th, 1621, Dutch forces attacked Banda Besar and Lantor. When the Bandanese resisted, the Dutch attacked with overwhelming force at 6 different points simultaneously, confusing and scattering the defenders. Over the next weeks, what unfolded was systematic and ruthless. The Dutch soldiers hunted down the Bandanese people across the islands. Some were killed in combat. Others tried to escape into the hills or attempted to reach English-held islands. Many of these refugees died from starvation or drowned trying to flee their homeland. On May 8, 1621, Cohen held kangaroo trials, fake court proceedings, where 44 captured Orinkaya were sentenced to death for violating their trade agreements. These weren't trials in any fair sense. They were show trials designed to justify what was about to happen. Cohen ordered Japanese mercenaries to behead these island leaders. Their heads were impaled on bamboo spears and left on display as a warning to anyone who might resist Dutch authority. On May 15, 1621, Cohen celebrated his victory with a banquet with his troops at Nassau Fortress. For Cohen, it was a moment of triumph. For the Bandanese, it marked the complete destruction of their world. Of the 15,000 people who had lived on the Banda Islands before the conquest, estimates suggest that approximately 14,000 were killed, enslaved, or forced to flee. Only about 1,000 Bandanese remained on the islands of Nera and Banda Besar. Hundreds more lived on the smaller islands of Ai and Run, but they were scattered, broken, and utterly defeated. An entire civilization had been nearly erased in the span of just a few months. The Bandanese population never recovered. 200 years later, slaves had to be continuously imported just to maintain a population of around 4,000 people on the islands, and even these were not Bandanese. They were people from Makassar, Bandanese merchants, Malays, Javanese, Chinese, Portuguese, and other peoples brought in chains to work on the nutmeg plantations. After destroying the island's native population, Cohen did exactly what he said he would do. He divided the productive land into 68 parcels called perkin, each about 1.2 hectares in size. Together, these lands contained approximately 500,000 nutmeg trees. Cohen then handed these plantations to Dutch planters called perkineers, essentially plantation owners. 34 perkin were established on Lantar, 31 on Ai, and 3 on Nera. But with almost all the Bandanese dead or gone, who would work these plantations? The answer was slavery. Cohen brought in enslaved people from across the archipelago, from Java, Sulawesi, Makassar, and beyond. These enslaved workers had no choice but to labor in the nutmeg groves for their entire lives. The VOC maintained tight control. It paid the planters only 1/122nd of the Dutch market price for their nutmeg. Yet despite this pittance, these planters became extraordinarily wealthy. They built massive villas decorated with opulent European furnishings and luxury goods imported from across the world. Their wealth came directly from the stolen labor of enslaved people and the stolen land of the Bandanese. With the Bandanese eliminated as competitors and replaced with enslaved laborers, the VOC finally achieved what it had always wanted, an absolute monopoly on nutmeg and mace production. From 1621 onwards, the VOC controlled virtually the entire world's supply of these spices. Between 1850 and 1859 alone, more than 2 centuries later, the islands still under VOC control produced around 28 million ounces of nutmeg. All of it was controlled by a single corporation. On the island of Run, which the English had held onto for a while, the VOC took no chances. They cut down the nutmeg trees to prevent any competition. The production and export of nutmeg remained a complete VOC monopoly for nearly 200 years. But here's where the VOC strategy revealed a fatal flaw. The Banda Islands were just one part of a much larger empire. The VOC was constantly at war, constantly maintaining expensive military garrisons, and constantly paying for administrators and soldiers. As the 18th century progressed, the VOC's costs spiraled. Smuggling undermined its monopolies. Competitors like the English East India Company, despite their earlier defeats, found other sources of spices. Corruption rotted the company from within. Officials were stealing from the company coffers. By 1720, the market for sugar from Indonesia declined as competition from cheap Brazilian sugar increased and European markets became saturated. By the late 18th century, the VOC was drowning in debt. The corporation that had been the richest private company the world had ever seen, paying dividends as high as 40% to shareholders, was now on the brink of collapse. The French Revolution and the wars that followed dealt final blows. When a French army invaded the Dutch Republic in 1795, the new Batavian Republic that was established became subservient to France. The VOC was left without government support. Amsterdam, the VOC's home, could no longer rescue their failing corporation. On December 20th, 1799, the Dutch East India Company was formally declared bankrupt. The government of the Dutch Batavian Republic took over the company's possessions and its massive debts. The corporation that had dominated global trade for nearly 200 years was dissolved. But even in dissolution, the impact of what the VOC had done to the Banda Islands remained. The islands never recovered their population. The Bandanese culture, which had thrived for thousands of years before the VOC arrived, was essentially erased. The islands became a monument to corporate greed, a place where an entire civilization was destroyed in the pursuit of profit. The story of the Dutch East India Company and the Banda Islands reveals something important about the world we live in. The VOC was not acting on government orders. It was a corporation, a business entity, that decided that controlling supply was worth more than sharing it, that eliminating competition was worth more than coexisting with it, that the lives of 15,000 people were worth less than a monopoly on spices. The Dutch East India Company did eventually collapse under the weight of its own corruption and debt, but the damage to the Banda Islands had already been done. When the Dutch formally left the Indonesian archipelago in 1949, the Banda Islands never became the thriving trading hub they had been. The population of the islands today numbers only around 20,000 people, less than it was before the massacre of 1621, 4 centuries ago. The Bandanese people and culture were largely lost to history. What remains is a reminder that when corporations are given the power of nations, and when profit becomes the only measure of success, entire civilizations can be wiped away. The islands once called the Spice Islands had their own story, a story of sophisticated traders, of economic independence, and of a way of life that lasted for thousands of years. The Dutch East India Company wrote a different ending to that story, and in doing so, they changed the course of world history in ways that are still felt today. The Banda Islands were the birthplace of modern corporate capitalism, and they paid a devastating price for that distinction.